and the many participants that are joining us virtually. My name is Dr. Teddy Sakupapa, Senior Lecturer in the Department of Religion and Theology at the University of the Western Cape, and I will be the moderator for the event this evening. It is a great joy to have all of you join us in person, as well as those of you joining us virtually at this very auspicious occasion. Let me begin by briefly making a few comments for our in-person participants to just ensure that we leave one seat in between in order for us to keep to the protocols around COVID, and to please keep your mask on for the duration of the event. You are welcome, and at this moment, I would like to welcome our Rector and Vice Chancellor for the University of the Western Cape to come and officially welcome all of us. And I must hasten that we are deeply delighted that our Rector and Vice Chancellor, Professor Thias Kgatla, is able to join us. And therefore, on behalf of the Department of Religion and Theology, we would like to invite you, Rector, to welcome us. Thank you, Rector.
Program Director, our two speakers tonight, Prof Kgatla and Prof Boesak, visitors to our campus, and I think you will agree with me, it's a remarkable transformed campus. It's situated next to a nature reserve. In fact, the only university in the country that manages a nature reserve. All of my UWC colleagues and dear friends, the participants on the virtually joining us, welcome. It is a great honor for me to welcome you to the Annual Belhar Confession Lecture, given today by Prof Kgatla, who is an extraordinary professor in our Department of Religion and Theology, and the respondent, Professor Boesak. The Belhar Confession, as you know better than me, has strong links to the university, and 3 of the 5 authors, Professors Dirkie Smit, Gustav Bam, and Jaap Turan. Jaap unfortunately passed away very recently. They were lecturers at the university at the time of drafting the Belhar Confession. When the confession was adopted on the 26th of September, it was at the height of the apartheid government's oppression. Our campus, as some of you will recall, like Llewellyn and Professor Boesak, our campus often resembled a war zone, with students fleeing the might of the security police, and we all felt very inhumane, violent, and disempowering effects of apartheid on every aspect of our life. The confession then came at the right time, rejecting the sinful separation of people and advocating instead that the world must believe that, and I quote, separation, enmity, and hatred between people and groups is a sin. Today we find ourselves 35 years after the Belhar Confession, and the world and our country has indeed changed very significantly. While many believe, as former President Nelson Mandela said, that we are no longer the skunks of the world because we no longer have the separation of our people according to race. But yet, in its stead, we have perpetuated and gained many other troubles and challenges that we still need to overcome as a country. Here I wish to refer to the Belhar Confession's mention of bringing justice to the oppressed, bread to the hungry, and support to the downtrodden. Because we continue to live in a most unequal society where naked greed has become the order of the day, and so too have hunger, poverty, and deprivation. The title of Prof Kgatla's lecture, Reading the Belhar Confession in a Wounded World, is therefore very appropriate and very necessary, because our world is indeed wounded, it is troubled. Whether we look inside our own borders, or we look more than 8,000 kilometers away in Ukraine, our world is deeply troubled. Here on our doorstep, violence against women and children continues unabated and seemingly without a solution. Just a few weeks ago, we were told that unemployment has hit a new record high, with 35.3% of South Africa's labor force being without jobs. Elsewhere in the world, there's much hatred and there is much intolerance. We do have a deeply wounded world. Coincidentally, this morning, I happened to read a quote by the author of Atlas Shrugged, Ayn Rand, which he wrote in 1957. I'd like to quote her words. When you see that trading is done not by consent, but by compulsion, when you see that in order to produce, you need to obtain permission from men who produce nothing, when you see money flowing to those who deal not in goods, but in favors, when you see that men get richer by graft and pull than by work, and your laws don't protect you against them, but protect them against you, when you see corruption being rewarded and honesty becoming a self-sacrifice, you may know that your society is doomed. That was written in 1957. I ask each one of you, how accurately do you think that describes the South Africa that we live in today? The Belhar Confession says that God, in a world full of injustice and enmity, is in a special way the God of the destitute, the poor, and the wronged. I'm sure that Prof Kgatla and Prof Boesak will speak to these and much more tonight. I look forward to hearing how the Belhar Confession, as powerful in its rejection of apartheid, finds connecting points with the world in which we live today. With those few words, welcome once again to UWC. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rector, for those words of welcome and words of challenge. At this point, I would like to welcome Professor Lepo Modise, who is the General Synod Moderator for the Uniting Reformed Church in Southern Africa, the church that is really doing a lot to further the legacy of the Belhar Confession. Prof Modise, you're welcome to bring greetings and remarks from UCSA. Prof Modise.
Thank you, Program Director, and all honorable guests, moreover, the Rector of this university. For us, as United Reformed Church in Southern Africa, it is another moment moment of history that has happened in this country. The Belhar Confession, when it was drafted, it was a gift to the world. But it has a history. In the Dutch Reformed Church in Africa, 1971, in the General Synod of Chilizini, the African evangelist in that synod, they echo their dissatisfaction about the happenings in the country and in the church. And then they propose that there must be a fourth confession in the Reformed churches. It was just but a proposal that was not taken very serious. The other wave of history happened in Worcester in 1975, where now they give this particular fourth confession a particular context. The fourth confession that will have the African background. And we will understand the disparity between the two churches that form the Uniting Reformed Church. The Dutch Reformed Church in Africa, its ministers were actually not trained to become thinkers of the church, but only to become evangelists in congregations. And then this God, the God of the Israelites, the God of Jesus of Nazareth, give light and illumination to our sister church by then, the Mission Church, to come up with this particular gift. The gift that today, it has been accepted by many denominations throughout the world. It is no more a Uniting Reformed Church confession. It is an ecumenical confession, which is confessed by so many churches. The ego of Belhar Confession, which shares God in a special way, is a God of the oppressed, of widows, orphans, downtrodden. It's echoed right at the Mediterranean Sea, where Africans are dying while trying to cross that particular sea for a better life. It's heard in Ukraine, it's heard in United States, where life of the blacks matters. It is joy for us as a United Reformed Church that the institution that has played a major role in shaping theologians that participated in the crafting of the Belhar Confession, the institution that participated in revolutionizing the minds of the ministers that they were training, to come to it and say, this ecumenical gift, we want you to give it further to the world in an academic way. In these few words, I would like to thank the management of this university, the council, the relevant department that participated in hosting this particular chair in this university. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof Modise. Prof Modise has touched on the ecumenical significance of Belhar. We have ecumenical partners to UCSA who are joining us virtually. And we have two messages of greetings, but also illustrating the ecumenical significance and international implications of the Belhar Confession. We will now listen to a short video that has been sent by Reverend Mark Luce, who is a member of the Commission, Church, and World in the United Presbyterian Church in Belgium. And after that, we'll listen to another short clip to illustrate the significance of Belhar beyond South Africa.
Beloved brothers and sisters of the Uniting Reformed Church in Southern Africa, dear Professor Kgatla, my name is Mark Loos and I greet you all in the name of the Synodical Council of the United Protestant Church in Belgium, and especially also in the name of the Church and World Commission of our Church. And I wish to warmly congratulate you on the appointment of Reverend Dr. Thias Kgatla as Extraordinary Professor of the University of the Western Cape for the purpose of continuing the promotion of the legacy of the Belhar Confession. It is with great gratitude and expectation that we express our support for this project. We also wish to congratulate Reverend Dr. Kgatla personally on his appointment to this important mission work and pray for every blessing in the process. As an international partner, we are looking forward to participate in the project in a concrete and direct manner. Since the United Protestant Church in Belgium accepted the Belhar Confession in 1998 and later in 2015 fully incorporated in the Constitution and Church Order of our Church, it has compiled two brochures to make the Belhar Confession known, studied and confessed. The publications are produced in both French and Dutch. We are convinced that further promotion and study of the Belhar Confession in this time and in the current context of far-right, racism, xenophobia, gender struggles, inequality and exploitation of the earth can absolutely contribute to a different and a better world for all peoples and to God's glory and honor. We are honored to be invited by the Department of Religion and Theology of the University of Western Cape at the Annual Belhar Confession Lecture on the 28th of April, delivered by Professor Dr. Thias Kgatla, and we are looking forward to it. We will follow the lecture by Zoom, and we will share the content of it in our church channels. We pray for this project so that the reading and confessing of the Belhar Confession may continue to heal many situations and lives of peoples in this wounded world. Many greetings for the Commission Church involved, for the Synodical Council of the United Protestant Church in Belgium, Pastor Mark Loos.
Church in the United States of America.
The Confession of Belhar has been a clarion call to action, and it has also been a source of encouragement and spiritual direction for those who struggle to break down the walls of division and exclusion, whether they have physical manifestations, as on the border between the US and Mexico, or the wall of oppression in Israel-Palestine, or whether those divisions are less tangible, as with the walls of heteropatriarchy and transphobia. We live in a world where many carry deep wounds of one sort or another. The medical and moral pandemics that have been such prominent features of our social and spiritual landscape for the past 2 years have exposed not simply the woundedness of individuals, but also the brokenness of our systems and structures. So the topic for tonight's lecture, Reading the Belhar Confession in a Wounded World, is especially apt. Though we have wounds, we are called to be wounded healers. The Confession of Belhar describes the active and practical ways in which unity must be expressed in loving service to one another. On behalf of the Presbyterian Church USA, I congratulate and I thank you for this significant initiative and this timely topic. I look forward to hearing from Professors Kgatla and Boesak, knowing that they will challenge us, inspire us, and enrich our continuing journey of faith and action. Thank you.
After those messages from Ecumenical partners, it is just about that time to introduce Prof Thias Kgatla, who is offering this year's Belhar lecture. Prof Selaelo Thias Kgatla is extraordinary professor in the Department of Religion and Theology at the University of the Western Cape. A holder of 2 doctoral degrees, Prof Kgatla has taught at several universities within South Africa, including the University of Limpopo and the University of Pretoria. Prof Kgatla's research and work revolves around the promotion and research on church witness in the world, interfaith dialogue, religious construct, and the role of religion in conflict transformation. Very often it is not possible for one to do full justice in introducing a man of Prof Thias's stature. May I simply say with these words, Prof, we're looking forward to your lecture this evening, and you are most welcome to please take us through the lecture for this day. A round of applause for Prof Kgatla.
Program Director, Dr. Kgatla, the Vice Chancellor and the Principal of the University of the Western Cape, Professor Pretoria. I hope Deputy Vice Chancellors and Executive Deans and Heads of Departments are not present. The Vice Chancellor of the University of Stellenbosch, Professor Nico Koopman, I don't know whether he's also present or is still coming. Professor Ernest Conradi, the moderator of the Uniting Reformed Church in Southern Africa, Professor Leopold Lamudis. The Deputy Moderator of Uniting Reformed Church in Southern Africa, Reverend Muta Lentwa Petra, and members of the General Synod Executive Committee, Reverend Adi Duplessis, the Secretary, Reverend Jacob Majola, representing KwaZulu-Natal Synod, Reverend LP Fokase, representing Free State Synod on that executive. Reverend Dr. Elias Montla, representing Northern Synod on the executive. And pioneering veterans of the Belhar Confession, I see Professor Allan Boesak present here. The moderator of the Reformed Church, I think he's not yet here, and the Regional Liaison Director for Southern Africa Presbyterian World Mission, Douglas J. Ton, and the moderator of Cape Synod, Dr. McMaster, alumni of University of Western Cape of 1970s and 1980s. Trustees of Belhar Confession, Reverend Mutalendra Beta, Reverend Peter Grove, Professor Johannes Klassen, Reverend Lucas Plagis, and May Desiree Brown. My colleagues at the Department of Religion and Theology at UWC, and members of the Uniting Reformed Church in Southern Africa, local and international partners of UCSA watching online, member churches of the South African Council of Churches, my fellow brothers and sisters, it is with great joy, excitement, and hope that I present this year's Belhar Confession Lecture. I'm honored to be granted the stewardship of the Belhar Confession Project. I'm grateful for the trust of both the University of Western Cape and the leadership of the Uniting Reformed Church in Southern Africa. 40 years ago, when the Church of Jesus Christ was confronted with the dark clouds of theological uncertainties and political system which was called crime against humanity by the United Nations, the Belhar Confession was conceived. Belhar Confession was born in the Black struggle against powers of darkness, greedy and unbelief. At that time, South African had difficulty with Christian religion because of the contradictions which were there. They saw in the church which brought the gospel to them. The youth in particular believed the notion that said, when the white missionaries came to South Africa, they had the Bible and we had the land. The missionaries said to us, let us close the eyes and pray. After the prayer, the whites had the land and we had the Bible. These stories were taking rounds during those days. Stories such as these has damaging effect on the youth, and they were reinforced by the inhumane political system that was there. But God in Jesus Christ intervened in a miraculous way that he made us to join him in Romans chapter 10, verse 9 to 10, that if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For it is with your heart that you believe and justified, and it is with your mouth that you confess and you are saved. This was the time when vibrant Reformed Confession was born in the dusty streets of the Black township of Belhar, and became the first Reformed Confession in Southern Hemisphere. The sounds of its ululations were heard in other Black townships such as Soweto, Montezane, Guguleto, Eersterus, Umlasi, Kututura, Namaqualand, and many others. My paper uses contextual lens to assess how Belhar Confession can be read in our wounded world, and how its legacy can give hope to the people living on the margins and are excluded. It is my contention that the harsh realities in which these people find themselves breed frustrations, apathy, weak eco structure, lowered aspiration and anger, or even the call for violence, such as we know in the country, the call of landless people, the call by service delivery groups, and the fees must fall calls. The violence engulfing our country can be linked directly with the socio-economic inequalities and resultant chronic corruption. I argue in this lecture that the social and economic condition we find ourselves in are linked to economic inequalities, as I've said, and chronic corruption in the country. The church is in a wounded world indeed. We are living in a disastrous and wounded world affected by ideologies such as racism, fascism, consumerism, and greed, characterized by inequalities and corruption. The institutional church, more often than not, finds herself on the receiving side and often opts to keep silent in the midst of all atrocities committed, especially against the powerless. What we know is that silence is not innocent. Silence may mean a tacit approval of inequalities and corruption, especially as the church becomes enveloped by the powerful and the rich at the expense of poverty-stricken masses. The great crisis the church is facing is its inability to be a church in the wounded world. It was Karl Barth who said, the challenge facing the church is to be a church and stay a church in the world of contradiction. In a country such as South Africa, riddled by inequalities and corresponding corruption that results in abject poverty and misery, violent protest, and yet professing to be the most democratic country in the world with the best constitution ever, it is a betrayal not to see the imbalances that are there. Often corruption and inequalities are directly and indirectly supported and justified by the rich and the powerful in the name of law and order, to control of the economy and authority. They would go as far as agreeing that the police, public servants, and politicians are corrupt and need radical transformation. But as far as those reforms keep the regime in place that protects their wealth, everything is in order. The cries of the poor, languishing in streets with empty stomach, are not heard. And yet God is calling in Exodus chapter 3, verse 7. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the application of my people in Egypt. I've heard them crying out because of their oppressors, and I am aware of their sufferings, that says the Lord. The first article of Belhar Confession states, we believe in the triune God, Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, who through word and spirit gathers, protects, and cares for the church from the beginning of the world and will do so to the end. The church that is unable to be property of God and stand where God is standing is wounded and incapacitated to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world. To confess Jesus Christ with our mouth and fail to see the plight of the poor in our midst, in our street, is reflective of the same colonial arrogance, of superiority and altruistic moral duty of development of the other. We therefore need a confessing church. And what is a confessing church? The confessing church was a movement within German Protestantism during Nazi Germany that arose in opposition to government-sponsored ideologies. This movement sought to preserve the purity of the gospel as stated in the Old and New Testament. The movement gave birth to Barham Theological Declaration of Faith in 1934 that affirmed the confessing church loyalty to Christ and set forth the limits of secular influence from outside and from inside the church. The movement confessed the unique lordship of Christ over every area of life, together with the rejection of any other ultimate authority in faith and in conduct. A confessing church is thus the movement that resists to be co-opted into any world ideologies that compromise the call of Jesus to be Lord and liberator of the oppressed. The mission of the confessing church is to re-establish church freedom and uncompromised faithfulness to God's word wherever they are under threat. The confessing church struggle involves three interwoven dimensions. First, the struggle between the confessing church and the false teachings. Second, the struggle between the confessing church and the secular authorities over spheres of influence. And third, the conflict within the confessing church itself. The early church was such a confessing church. In this church, confession was a matter of life and death, saying, this is what we believe, and even if we have to die for it, we cannot compromise on it. To them, to confess meant what they lived by, what they regarded as their reason for living, and setting their hearts on what they believe and living by the consequences. When they confessed that Jesus is Lord, they were explicitly and boldly asserting that Caesar, the ruler of the time, or Roman Empire, was not the Lord. They were doing that against the boards which were written, Caesar is Lord, Caesar is Lord. And they said, no, no, Caesar is not Lord, but Jesus is Lord. For that they were killed, some of them. To confess that Jesus is Lord was not only to say something about Jesus, but also about the emperor. It was declaration that Caesar Augustus was not Lord. They were prepared to be charged with treason for their confession. That church could not compromise with fascism, racism, falsehood, inequalities, corruption, and escapism of structural sins or plundering of God's creation. The closing stanza of Belhar Confession captures this vividly, even though the authorities and human laws might forbid them, and punishment and suffering be the consequences. We will follow Jesus, Jesus alone. The Belhar Confession is loud and clear in what the true church intends to live by and even die for. Ernst Wolff described a confession as a text in which the biblical witness is summarized and focused upon a particular challenge in the life of the church. Confessing as a basic way of defining the daily task in the life of the Christians. It has to do with how our faith bears on the multitude of issues, social, personal, economic, and political, as well as cultural, that affect our daily lives and our relationship with God and his mission to the poor, oppressed, and underclass. The confessing church will be able to read and understand the anguish of the poor, while clearly seeing the agenda of the rich who protect their interest by controlling, for example, how knowledge, how economy, politics, for their interest should be protected. In the Belhar Confession, we identify three hallmarks of the true church confession. First, confession is a response to emergency which threatens the very essence of being the church. The confession calls upon the church to transcend the limitation that prevent it from being church. Apartheid, for example, affirmed that South Africans were all made equal and shared the same destiny. And yet indigenous people of the country were not as equal as their white counterparts. This was a deception of language they used and the knowledge they wanted to inculcate in the minds of Black majority to remain docile. To respond to these fundamental challenges, the confessing church had to come up with a big no to something that was fundamentally wrong and evil, with a big yes to the affirmation of the fullness of life that the Creator wants all people to share equally. The years of confession called for solidarity and advocacy, as is in Proverbs 31, 8-9. Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and the needy. Stand with all those facing injustice, those who are excluded, and bid farewell to set your consciousness that try to rewrite the gospel to suit their greedy interest. Second, confession calls the church to a decision based on the entire scripture and to take the struggle to a rightful level. In a confession, the church is urgently called upon to look at what constitutes the Kairos moment, a time when conditions are right for the accomplishment of a crucial action. The opportune and decisive moment for action. The Kairos moment includes the need to repudiate heresy not only in the church life, but also in society. It is an opportune moment to cooperate with the Spirit of God, to act without hesitation. This speaks more to specific, God-ordained times throughout history, sometimes called the right time or appointed session. Like we read in Titus 1 verse 3, a time for action against the principalities of darkness and death. Lastly, third, confession begins with acknowledgement of guilt and complicity, with a call to the church not to be caught up in grandstanding or being judgmental in character, but involved in creating bold humility, interceding, exhorting, and interrogating its actions while inviting those who are outside to receive the gift of unity, reconciliation, and justice. Now I turn to 6 to 7 proposed areas where the Confession of Belhar should focus on in our country today. 7 interrelated areas in the study of Belhar Confession include the following: racism in all its forms and manifestation in society. Secondly, unquestionable and unconstrained global thirst of consumerism, inequalities and corruption, fake news politics, economics, religion, and media designed to colonize the very minds of the underside of history. 5, femicide, the killing of women or girls by men in our country. 6, climate change and environmental degradation. 7, Belhar and ecumenism. I've already alluded to the fact that the confession is a no, a big no to a fundamental situation that threatens the integrity of the gospel. It is therefore a big no to racism, to femicide, to unquestionable global consumerism, fake news propaganda, and climate degradation, and it is a big yes of the affirmation of fullness of life, that the Creator wants all his creation to share equally. And big yes of confession calls for solidarity with those who are on the margins and are excluded by design, as well as treatment of all creation as a gift to be treasured, shared equally, and looked after. Now I start with racism, discrimination, and xenophobia. Racism in South Africa was officially instituted and theologically justified by the White Reformed Church at the table of Lord's Supper. In response to the situation which constituted the Kairos moment, the Uniting Reformed Church in South Africa said no to that ideology and yes to unity, reconciliation, and justice of all believers. It was later joined by other Reformed churches in the world who accepted the gift of Belhar Confession. Despite the Christian witness, racism in South Africa is clearly found everywhere in society, even in the churches. Racism continues to wreak havoc on human harmony and common goals in a country that claims that more than 80% of its citizens are Christians. In its vacillation, it adopts offensive language and sometimes varies it into euphemism and quoted language in order to render its action invisible through words and language. Often racism employs altruistic gestures to hide its vicious face. In Afrikaans, they talk about vroom oneerlikheid. I don't know whether it is a holy dishonesty. As an ideology of racial discrimination and racial inequality, it employs its tentacles of racial inequality, racial discrimination, and othering of other people. It is both explicit and implicit in its operation, depending on the circumstances and what it wants to achieve. The statute of Belhar Confession leaves no stone unturned. These things should be engaged, face on. Femicide, the killing of women or girls by male. South Africa has one of the highest femicide rates in the world. The recent world release on violence against women puts South Africa at number 5 out of 183 nations. The latest crime statistics released by the Department of Police reveal the depth of the crisis. Nearly 3,000 women were murdered between April 2018 and March 2020. And according to the latest reports, approximately 51% of South African women have experienced physical violence of some kind. President Ramaphosa, in his SONA, called the pandemic to be the second pandemic in the country. And the greatest sin, or the original sin women have committed, is that they were born women. That is their sin. The crisis of femicide in South Africa calls on all churches to do what they did to apartheid in the 70s and 80s, confessing that Jesus is Lord. One remaining silent on the brutalizing of his children by fellow human being does not constitute a big yes from Belhar Confession. However, declaring femicide a national crisis and announcing status confessioners does constitute a big yes, and is a step to unity, reconciliation, and justice. Belhar cautioned that the church is the church when it is a church for others. The church is set in the reality of the world, that this reality
should disclose God, and the church should be that reality. Church is the bridge for the truth of the word. Self-disclosure means the bridge building that leads to church sharing its life with the poor. Hence, Dutch Hottentot expression, church inside out. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 8, we read, because we loved you so much, and that is Paul writing to Thessalonians, we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well. Inequality leads to corruption. Corruption leads to further inequality. Again, according to World Bank reports on equality in Southern Africa, an assessment of South African Customs Union released on 9 March this year, South Africa is the most unequal country in the world, ranking number 1 among 164 countries. The World Bank also reported that the richest in South Africa, 20% of the richest people in South Africa, control almost 70% of the resources. Equally, we can say that South Africa is one of the most corrupt countries in the world. I will try to explain this, because inequality and corruptions are soulmates. They go together. Corruption thrives on economic inequalities, while economic inequalities provide fertile breeding ground for corruption. And in turn, corruption leads to further inequalities. The path from inequalities to corruption may be indirect, but the connection between the two is the key to understanding why some societies are corrupt or unequal than the others. Usalena described inequality trap as a phenomenon in cultures where high inequality levels lead to low trust in outgroups and increases high trust among the in-group, those who are close in the ranks. Wallace defines outgroup communities as people who experience extreme poverty in their own land, and they experience chronic domestic violence, homelessness, violence, powerlessness, unemployed, excluded, and living in insecurity and squalor condition. I think this describes South Africa very clearly. This is the country in which we are living. They live in an environment where they are fundamentally denied choices of opportunities. Their humanity is violated. They are denied basic capacity to participate in society, and they have no space to lead a decent life. They are susceptible to violence and live in the marginal or fragile environments, have no access to clean water, and their identity is shaped by damaging aspects of poverty, such as poverty of motivation, poverty of initiative, poverty of hope, poverty of opportunity, poverty of resources, poverty of spirit. Unfortunately, the very people who gain the most when they are poor are crushed are those who control political and economic system. Many of these have considerable devotion to orderly social society, law and order. If there is a demonstration and so on, they are the most worried people. They can hardly give up on their privilege to share with those who are at the bottom of the ladder of poverty. Osalana further argues that The roots of corruption are largely not institutional, but rather stem from economic inequality and a mistrust in the ruling elite when the majority poor people become despondent and lose faith that their future will ever be bright. They resign to their fate as they become resentment of their wealthy neighbors. Inequality breeds corruption by turning the majority poor people inward and reducing the trust in their wealthy neighbors. I think if you look at South Africa, even the last recent election, you see this scenario, you see these things unfolding, that the poor have reached a stage where they are no longer trusting those who are leading. The opposite of inequality trap, on the other hand, is when the majority people trust that the foundation of the well-ordered society are in place, and when they believe that the most people can be trusted and are looking for their welfare. This is the solution to South African situation, not the brutality of the police. That is not going to eliminate corruption and inequality. It's when the leaders can be trusted, can create a situation in which the poor can trust them and start following them. High levels of protest and violence denote low level of trust in the people who should deliver services. Citizens who have trust in their leaders are usually satisfied with what their leaders are doing than the citizens who do not trust them. Number 4, unquestionable and unrestrained global capitalist consumerism and Belhar Confession. Globalizing, hegemonizing, as some call it, is a global drive force of the global village by large companies, for example, Coca-Cola and McDonald's, with a drive for unlimited acquisition of wealth. For instance, in 2020, Coca-Cola company was very upset with the footballer Cristiano Ronaldo when the footballer refused to take Coca-Cola. And he said in Portuguese, aqua, water, water. And the Coca-Cola was very upset by that. Why does he choose water above Coca-Cola? On the religious front, fundamentalist religious groupings, such as those in mega churches, export prosperity gospel in an unprecedented manner, seriously distorting social values and communal life. Furthermore, Pentecostalism, not all of them, under the influence of wealth and health, has become a globalized entrepreneurial spirit that flourishes on the appalling social condition in which poor people find themselves, while enriching powerful self-styled prophets. This cult is built on the notion that God loves his people and wants them all to have material possession in abundance, and brushes aside all scriptures that clearly locate human suffering as part of God's plan. And that is the cash weight. Framing the cause of poverty as the work of Satan, principalities or powers of darkness in the space, but not human constructed, is outrageous act of criminality. This view serves delusional escapism that prevents the facing of responsibility for corruption, inequalities, greed, unfair policies by blaming abstract forces that have nothing to do with the crime. Portioning blame on metaphysical beings while ignoring evil social structures of inequality and violence, is a manifestation of chronic deception that portrays the entire agenda of Christianity. David Boyle, in his book Authenticity, speaks of the world that has lost coolness of mind, where soberness has dried up. This constitutes the serious woundedness of the world in modern times. True confession should appropriately declare a big no to this lie while saying a yes to the fullness of life as Christ promised to the poor. The witness of Belhar Confession should be made unequivocally clear in such circumstances. Number 5, between fake news and the Belhar Confession, truth and truthfulness are indispensable to Christian witness. Jesus told his disciples that they would know the truth and the truth would make them free. Free from what? Free from enslaving fake bubble of falsehood. Most professing Christians view truth according to Jesus' statement, your word is truth, John 70, verse 70. Christ viewed truth as part of God's character, which identifies truth as part of very character of the being who lives their lives. The stark reality today is that some mainstream politicians are unwilling to surrender their view of what the truth is. High-profile politicians, people such as journalists, politicians, religious leaders, and cooperative executives have sacrificed the integrity of their social position in pursuit of self-interest at the demise of the majority of people inhabiting the earth. The recent events on global landscape inaugurated unprecedented challenges through the process of political, economic, cultural, and religious innovation. The most recent one we know is that which happened in 2016 with the election of American President Donald Trump. And it is said in the media that that man, 2,000 words he speaks, only 10% may be correct. In 2017, we had the opportunity of having a teleconference with him as a country. And that, of course, spoke a lot about us at that time. It is important for Belhar Confession to explore the veracity of the post-truth era that triggered the lessening of true values and the introduction of fake news and alternative facts into the world, and to investigate the connection between these new phenomena and globalization, as well as how they dovetail, as they have a big impact on the prophetic church and its witness. Deception and distortion have become commonplace at all levels of the contemporary political, economic, and religious world. Alas, many churches have fashioned themselves accordingly. In a country of many resources, high levels of unemployment, greed, corruption, and drive for instant wealth, truth is sacrificed on the altar of expediency. Telling lies in order to achieve personal interest has become a norm, as long as the person is not caught and brought to book. The voice of Belhar Confession should be made ostensibly clear on matters like this. Number 6, climate change, environmental deterioration, and the Belhar Confession. William Nordhaus, Nobel laureate in physics in 2018, described a new era in which the world is today as a climate casino. He said that we are rolling the global warming dice. Climate change and its connection to the global economy, consumerism, racism, femicide, and fake news is intrinsically linked to the church confession. What is happening with creation today? The earth has been turned into casino economy, involving reckless living with absolute disregard gift God has given to humanity right in his face. German human rights theologian Ulrich Duhem questioned whether the church still champions the life of a human being, cherishes the life of a human being, and the whole earth, or whether is side with the global economic systems. Now, the last one on that list is Belhar and Ecumenism. Ecumenism is a movement to promote Christian unity. Jesus founded one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Catholic Church is used in this text to mean one universal church. Ecumenism is needed because despite the will of God, we the people get divided up when individuals and groups don't hear what God is saying. Belhar Confession is well placed as a gift to serve the unity, reconciliation, justice, and church of Jesus Christ. Now, in conclusion, I want to highlight the following. I want to unpack 7 propositions to summarize what Belhar Confession can and cannot do to community of faith in a wounded world. The Belhar Confession stirs believers to action, humbles them to see themselves as those who are gathered, protected and cared by trained God, inspires them to witness about Christ, the crucified, in the wounded world. Belhar performs a critical function by continuously challenging the church to hear what the Spirit is telling the churches, while calling her to read the signs of time. It accomplishes the prophetic voice, constantly modeling its witness to that of pre-exilic Old Testament prophets, such as Amos, Isaiah, and others. 3, it denounces the structural and social establishments that deny the poor fullness of life, and denounces the church compromising on the sin of indifference to the social and structural sin in the world. 4, Belhar Confession acts like a butterfly in the house of church, creating uneasiness and tension as it resists complacency and opposing any inclination towards self-preservation. It stings like a bee, causing annoyance to the privileged and rich while creating hope for the poor, downtrodden, and the marginalized. It cuts like two-edged sword, leaving injuries in the very house it was born. The Belhar Confession, in contrast with false ideologies or truncated theologies serving the interests of the elites, sides with the orphans, the destitute, the oppressed, the persecuted, those condemned for being prophetic, and those killed for being the opposite of the greedy and the corrupt of this world. It condemns all those court prophets or priests who support the kings and who are shameless in their proclamation of fake news and fake promises. Belhar Confession speaks with clarity and boldness against political, economic, cultural, and social practices that contradicts the purpose of God. It is reimagining an alternative world of well-being, justice and peace, prosperity for all, and security. In Belhar Confession, we see the possibility of replacing human suffering and human and hate in this world of the powerful. Its main aim is the search for social justice and liberation of the oppressed and downtrodden. And it is always drawing public attention, not to the church interest, but to God's liberating process. The Belhar Confession constitutes a prophetic witness. That is God authorizing voice to speak on his behalf to the world as God news to those who are in distress and carrying indelible scars of exploitation, oppression, injustice, and misery. Pronounces those who are following their own selfish and corrupt ways to turn around and face the truth. In response to social and structural sins, the prophetic church is an agent of social transformation and realignment. In this regard, the Belhar Confession calls for unity, reconciliation, and justice. Finally, Program Director, I wish each one of you well and ask you to join me in cherishing the spirit of Belhar Confession, to feel great and privileged to participate in the call of this vibrant reform confession midwifed in the Southern Hemisphere for the world, midwife in the dusty streets of Black Township, as I've already indicated. May the spirit of Belhar Confession connect those of us gathered in this hall this evening with a vast community of alumni and friends across United Reformed Church in South Africa, member churches in Southern Africa, ecumenical partners from Africa, from North America, Latin America, Europe, Eastern Europe, Asia, in fact, in the whole world. To UWC and UCSA, I say you have bestowed on me the greatest honor that the university and the church combined can possibly bestow on a person. The opportunity to serve as the servant of Belhar Confession legacy. I cherish this trust and I promise I'll honor it. I thank you.
Another round of applause, colleagues and gentlemen, to Prof Kgatla. Thank you very much, Prof Kgatla. Without further ado, I would like to invite the respondent, Professor Allan Boesak, a man who needs no introduction on the grounds of UWC. Prof Allan Boesak is a well-known South African Black liberation theologian and global human rights activist. He's also a prolific author who has authored 23 books, the most recent being Children of Waters of Meribah, Black Liberation Theology, the Miriamic Tradition, and the Challenges of 21st Century Empire. Most significantly, under his leadership in the now World Communion of Reformed Churches, they declared apartheid a sin and a heresy and suspended the two white Dutch Reformed churches in South Africa for their moral and theological justification of the apartheid system. I cannot do full justice to his immense contribution. Prof Boesak is currently Professor of Black Liberation Theology and Ethics at the University of Pretoria. It is a great joy to welcome you, Prof Boesak, and we look forward to listening to your response. Prof Boesak, a round of applause, colleagues.
Thank you so much, Program Director. Good evening, brothers and sisters, Professor Pretorius, my colleague, Professor Modise, and especially Professor Kgatla. Thank you so much for this invitation to be here tonight with you and to respond to your excellent lecture tonight. Also, I want to welcome you and Mrs. Kgatla to our community here in the Cape. I want to wish you well in this endeavor, the chair that you will be holding, the work that you will be doing. I wish you every blessing on that most important work for our church, but also for the whole ecumenical community. And I want to thank UWC, who has made such gracious and generous room for that work in establishing this chair. Professor Kgatla, I appreciate your lecture very much. I appreciate the wide and global scope of your vision, situating Belhar into the struggles of the global church and the global community in the last decade or so. I have been drawn more and more into the work of the World Communion of Reformed Churches, and especially their justice work, and much to my delight and my gratitude, I have seen how the Belhar Confession has been embraced by these ecumenical bodies and the churches they represent, and how much Belhar has informed and shaped and inspired their work for justice. In that sense, Professor Modise is absolutely right. Belhar is no longer, perhaps for a very long time, never been the child of Urksa alone. It has become the child of the ecumenical church in just about every way, and that to my great joy. I am in total agreement of so much that you have been saying tonight, beginning with the need for a confessing church. The need for a confessing church is central to the discussions, but it has been central to our discussions since the early 1970s in the Broederkring of those days that we renamed the Confessing Circle. And since then, we understood an even greater need, though, and that is to be able to make the difference between a confessing church and a church with a confession. A church with a confession has something on paper. A confessing church has something in its heart, which lives out in the world and testifies to for everyone to see. It's a church that talks about its prophetic faithfulness, its prophetic truthfulness, its prophetic mindfulness. And with all of that, it joins the struggles for justice and peace and dignity and humanity in the world. By the time Belhar was written and adopted, we had already begun the struggle against the ideological perversion of the Reformed tradition the White Dutch Reformed Church had made of it. And by the time Belhar became a reality, we were already in the streets of protest and confrontation, having joined the resistance against the colonialist apartheid regime. And in that sense, the Belhar Confession was alive in our hearts and in our struggles long before it was born into the world on paper. And such a confession would take account of the peculiar situation of South Africa with its history of invasions by Christians, projects of imperialism and colonialism driven by Christians, plundering, dispossession, and exterminating our people, all executed in the name of God. And then followed by apartheid. Simultaneously, the confession would hold on to the fact that it's grounded in the truth that we fight a system that claimed to be Christian, based on the Bible, giving rise to, upheld, and justified by a theological and biblical construct called the theology of apartheid. Unique in all of these ways, apartheid posed challenges to the Church of Jesus Christ in South Africa as unique. How was the question that most crucially challenged our faith? Shall we confess Jesus Christ as Lord in a situation such as this? How shall we confront the forces of an immediate and unnameable and evil perpetrated in the name of Christ? How shall we witness in the name of the gospel when the gospel itself was both the instrument and the justification of the oppression, the exploitation, and the misery of our people at the hands of other people who also claim to call Jesus Christ Lord? How shall the church respond to the cries of the poor and the oppressed when we know that John Calvin was right, that the cries of the oppressed for justice, freedom, and dignity are cries from the very heart of God, that God hears God's self cry when the oppressed cry, how long? And seeing the struggles of our people against the injustices of a system rightly labeled a crime against humanity, how shall the church join that struggle for justice that full humanity requires? And in the midst of all of that, how shall the church give account of the hope that is within us, so as to give voice to the voiceless, power to the powerless, and hope to the hopeless? How shall we find refuge in God when God's self has become the refuge of the thief and the plunderer and the genocide? How shall we sing Yahweh is our rock when the rock is not the rock of salvation that mercifully redeems, but the rock that mercilessly crushes? At the heart of the confession is what we confess about God. We believe the confession says that God has revealed God's self as the one who wishes to bring about justice and true peace on earth. That in a world full of injustice and enmity, God is in a special way the God of the destitute, the poor, and the wronged, and that God calls the church to follow God in this. That God brings justice to the oppressed, gives bread to the hungry, and that God frees the prisoners, restores the sight of the blind, that God is the savior of the downtrodden, the protector of the stranger, the help of the orphans and the widows, the one who blocks the path of the ungodly. And that the church must therefore stand by people in any form of suffering and need, and that the church must witness against and strive against, not only witness against, but strive against any form of injustice, so that justice may roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream, and that the church, as the possession of God, should stand where God stands, namely against injustice and with the wronged. And it was with these unshakable convictions in Belhar that we discerned what you, Professor Kgatla, rightly identify as the three conflicts that marked the life and witness of the prophetic confessing church, namely the conflict between the church and the idolatries of the world, the conflict between the church and earthly principalities, and the conflict within the church itself. And I mean within the confessing church, like our own church. I mean the conflict within URCSA itself, in our struggles to respond to the consequences of our own confession up to this day, in our theology, in ourselves, and in our public witness. And succinctly put, Belhar confesses God's radical, indivisible justice, God's radical, indivisible solidarity, God's radical, indivisible inclusivity, God's radical, indivisible love. And so while Belhar came into being in apartheid South Africa, the confession itself rises above and reaches far beyond racism and apartheid, beyond the crises caused by those realities, in the midst of and into the present crises of our world that the church are faced with and trying to grapple with. And that is why I would have loved to add one more area of concern to the 7 that you have raised. And that is the area where URCSA has most failed Belhar, our siblings in Christ, and our efforts towards our country's democratic life. And I mean thereby the struggle of LGBTQI people and trans people for justice, dignity, and worthiness, both in the sight of God, under the law, and in the community of the church. And when you say it is betrayal not to see the injustices, this is our great betrayal. And I hope that this program will give this righteous cause the respectful room it deserves. When from 1976 on, the students crowded our chapel services on this campus, where our student pastor, they came to renew their faith, that faith without which the Biko reminded us no nation can win a struggle. And they came to strengthen their resolve. They came to find courage in the face of the dogs and the guns and the tear gas. They came to find the strength for the frightening loneliness of prison and for the fear of torture, the horrors of being ground into nothing for the sake of eventually nothing, for the possibility of death. And they also came to find some reason not to give up hope, to discover anew why a life of self-sacrifice is a good life. Belhar was not yet words on paper, but it already was a living, breathing testimony to everything that we stood for. Now, 40 years later, in a post-1994 South African society, Belhar continues to define still today who we are and what we are as a church, our understanding of the demands of the gospel, our response to the realities of the world we live in, our obedience to Christ in terms of the great global challenges facing the church today. And all this to determine the presence of God and our place in the revolutions for justice, freedom, and dignity going on in the world right now as we speak, to keep straight the path that leads to abundant life. Belhar comes from oppressed communities who in themselves were bereft of their voice, yet chosen by God to speak truth to power. With no name in the street, as the book of Job so poignantly speaks of the wretched of the earth, yet they dare to name God in the sanctuary as well as in the public square, in the inner prayer room, as well as in the streets of protest and confrontation. They, the powerless, discovered within themselves a power. They spoke with an authority because they lived with authenticity, embodying the meaning of authentic life, of authentic power amidst the devastations of their times. Not commissioned by the powerful for the legitimation of earthly power. Belhar places earthly power under the critique of heaven and earth, the critique of the outraged God and of the suffering people. In his words pulsates a life lived not under the protection of the throne, but in the shadow of the cross. In his birth, his continued life, in his prophetic presence, and in his insistence upon God's radical, indivisible justice, God's radical, indivisible equality, God's radical, indivisible inclusivity, as we have seen again and again these past 40 years. Belhar is what the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians called a scandalon. But precisely as scandalon, as a stumbling block, as an offensive, disturbing, disrupting presence in the church and in the world, Belhar defines us as a church, as a guiding light on the way to abundant life of justice, peace, dignity, and full humanity. It was a living liturgy of revolutionary commitment and embodied solidarity before it even was a theological document in those devastating years of the states of emergency during 1985 and 1989. In those years, Belhar was believed and Belhar was enacted on the streets of resistance in sacrifice, in blood, in courage, and indestructible hope. I contend that in the choice for justice and human flourishing in the 21st century, as you have so clearly pointed out, in the new struggles for ecological, socio-economic, and cultural justice, and especially as it pertains to the matters that go beyond a race, confronting the church in the reality of eco-justice, gender justice, and the justice for sexually differently oriented persons. Therein lies the true value and the true applicability and the true power of Belhar. In the issues beyond the challenges of apartheid racism, it is crucial that the church testifies to a confession that has indeed outlived apartheid, and show that it can face the consequences of its prophetic faithfulness in the world and within itself. Now, there was a time in South Africa when the church joined the students and the youth, the workers and the unemployed, people from every walk of life, across the artificial barriers of skin color and race and class and culture and religion and language, in the struggle for justice and freedom. There was a time we did not, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer admonished us, live with our heads in the clouds. We saw the world of apartheid through the eyes of those who suffered, and we rose up in resistance. Our protest was stubborn, and we gave witness as we stood up for God's love and justice and compassion. We did it because of our faith, guided by the truth at the heart of Belhar that Jesus Christ alone is Lord. We gave witness to our hope anchored in our faith. There was a time we faced tear gas and dogs and guns. We were imprisoned and beaten and tortured. We lived lives of self-sacrifice. We were purposeful. We felt the pain of our people and we shared the dreams of freedom. Through their eyes, we saw visions of justice and equity. Having set our mind on the things above, as Paul reminds us, we fought for the things that make for peace. We were not content with an unjust world. We knew we were not a people destined for oppression and tyranny and destruction. There was such a time. But that was before the days of euphoria and delusion. Before we told ourselves that a negotiated settlement signified the coming of the reign of God. Before we decided that faithfulness to our people's sacrifices was far too much of a hindrance into the profitable deals made with the old white apartheid capitalist classes. Before we were mesmerized by the wizardry of mammon so much that we forgot the subversive memory of Jesus Christ. Before we were trapped in the politics of manufactured contentment, allowing ourselves to believe that we were exceptional. We were a nation at peace with itself and with the world. We were the rainbow nation, even though our reconciliation, while full of forgiveness, was one without remorse or repentance or restitution. without the restoration of land or history or the dignity of justice. It is no wonder that we ended up where we are today as a country and as a people. We are a people severely diminished by politics without principle, by leadership without vision, by policies without commitment, and hence inflicted by failure after failure. We are drowning in corruption, lies, and cover-ups. We are plagued by deceit, confounded by subterfuge. Our disastrous choices in economic policies have deepened the generational impoverishment of our people while creating new millionaires every second week, it seems, making us the most unequal society in the world today. We have become, writes Dr. Bani Patiana in a scathing indictment of our political elites, and aggressively filthy, selfish, individualistic, and greedy society that cares only for itself and its own. And no wonder we ended up here with revived racism, re-invited colonialism, re-embraced tribalisms of every sort, reinvented ethnic nationalism on the rampage. Our people have lost trust in just about every single democratic institution we have. The politics of the stomach has overtaken and swallowed up whole the politics of decency, integrity, honesty, courage, and virtue we held so high as our ideals during the struggle. We are held hostage by thieves and plunderers of the resources of the nation, of the hopes of our elders, and of the dreams of our children. And so the question remains, Professor Kgatla, that I'm asking with you. Can we reclaim Belhar? Can it help us to navigate our way through this wilderness, over the scorched earth of what we have become over the last 40 years, to that river of righteousness that beckons us on the other side? My answer is yes, and this is also my plea. The church, Belhar proclaims, is the possession of God. Jesus is Lord. What does that mean, though? It means that God, the God of Jesus of Nazareth, not the false God that blesses slavery, apartheid, genocide, and oppression, is a God of justice, and that God calls the church, that is, those of us who call upon the name of Jesus and seek to follow him as his disciples, to follow God in this, that the church must therefore stand by people in any form of suffering and need, no excuses, no exceptions, no compromises, which means that the church must witness against any form of injustice, that the church as the possession of God, not the possession of the privileged and the powerful, of the strong and the loud mouth, of the arrogant and the self-satisfied, or the cowardly and the indifferent, of the prejudiced and the bigoted, should stand where God stands, namely against injustice and with the wrong. If we truly believe this, if we truly live this and enact this, the angels in heaven will rejoice in our faithfulness, and this world will indeed be a different place. With Belhar as living testimony of our life and witness, the staff upon which we lean as we walk the path of righteousness, as the voice calling for justice, we do not need the approval of those in power. We do not need their letters of recommendation in the positions of status and privilege. We do not need their support. It is as the Apostle Paul says about the Corinthians, Belhar itself, lived, loved, and enacted, becomes the letter inscribed upon your hearts, to be known and to be read by all humanity, written not in ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of the human heart. Our struggles for good life, for justice life, for fulfilled life have not been in vain. So writes Arundhati Roy, that amazingly gifted sister from India. We have, she says, won many victories already, and we must find courage and hope in the fruits of our agency and our victories. Every step forward counts. She says, we have each in our own way laid siege to empire. We may not have stopped it in its tracks yet, but we have stripped it down. We have made it drop its mask. We have forced it out into the open. It now stands before us on the world stage in all its brutish, iniquitous nakedness, too ugly to behold its own reflection. And then, echoing the faith and the resilience of our ancestors, surrounding us like a cloud of witnesses, urging us on not to give up on what is good and right and righteous, Arundhati Roy says, another world is not only possible, she is already on her way, and on a quiet day, I can hear her coming. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Prof Boesak. Colleagues, friends, we have had an exciting lecture and thought-provoking response. We'll invite a few questions. If you could keep it short and sweet. And if you may just begin by introducing yourself, just your name and the institution that you're representing, and pose your question. Could I see if we have any hands to raise any questions? Thank you very much. I see one hand over there. Is there another indication so that we could take one round, and then also invite perhaps Prof Kgatla, if you want to very briefly engage with some of the thoughts that Prof Boesak has raised. So we have a hand over there. If you could just say your name and the institution and pose your question.
Okay, my name is Zanugushi Mayapi, and I'm representing the EFF Student Command. So my question is quite simple and crisp. I would love to find out, firstly, I see here it's Belhar Confession in a Wounded World, and I'm from Belhar, an area called Belhar. So I want to find out if is there a correlation between the area called Belhar, which is just a minute away from UWC, and this Belhar being referred to here. Secondly, I want to hear from the side of the Belhar Trust, what is the stance of the Belhar Trust in terms of in what the EFF speaks about, which is land expropriation without compensation, having to believe that the land was taken through criminal means and that the people it was taken from still do not have the land. What is the stance of the trust in relation to that, since we're also speaking about justice? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much. I think we have two questions there. The one directed to Prof Kgatla, and I think the other one around Belhar. Perhaps Prof Boesak could respond to that, given the questions around the sense in which Belhar is a living document. And I would like to invite Prof Kgatla, if you could respond, and after that we will have Prof Boesak responding to the other question. We have another question, perhaps before the response. We could take the questions together. I haven't seen the hand.
Okay. My name is Peter from UWC. One of the conventions of the church is against the secular influence, according to the speakers. And I look at the conventions beyond with broader ecumenical focus. This is the questions that come in the views of what is going on generally in Africa. And I want to zero it down to the the influence of the impact of the religions conflict that has bring into the churches. For example, a practical example somebody just shares with the research that said,
we'll try to ask if you can keep it
swiftly, okay, sir.
Short.
Because of the constant effect of the religious conflict, especially against the Christian, there's a view that some are going back, find of a means of using it as a defense mechanism, looking at the form of African wars of theology, African traditional religions of means of using a lot of things of defending themselves. Now, in the midst of where the church, they felt that the church could not be able to do much to defend them in the midst of this crisis. How should we handle the confessions, especially coming to the issues of syncretism, coming into the church, being filled with the powers, being filled that they put shams and omelets, and at the same time worshiping God, believing in Yahweh at the same time, and at the same time believing in the African traditional way of using me as a means of defending themselves.
Sure. Thank you so much. I think one picks up also there perhaps a question around ideology and the sense in which Belhar Confession might have wider societal significance. And I think Prof Boesak touched on the distinction between a confessing church and a church with a confession. Perhaps I would ask Prof Kgatla, just briefly, if you could respond to that, and Prof Boesak could do that. And just before we do that, we want to just thank our rector for having been able to join us. Thank you so much, Rector. We sincerely appreciate it. Thank you very much. Sure. Now ask Prof Kgatla to give a brief response, and then Prof Boesak.
Thank you very much. The first question, I really did not follow what was the question. Oh, okay, okay. And the second question is about how confession can defend the people who are attacked by other religion. Is that is that the question? How can confession defend people who are attacked by other religions? I'm asking Peter. You said your name is Peter. You ask a question about the confession defending people who are attacked by other religion. Is that? Well, perhaps we need more clarity to that question, where the confession can defend other people by its nature. By its nature, confession is for the protection of all people created by God, by its nature. So I may not know the context in which you are asking this question. I must admit, I don't know. Perhaps Professor Boesak got it more clear how the confession can protect the people who are attacked by other religions. And I think, well, perhaps I can just add, look, as Christians, we not like militia, which is going to protect other people who are attacked. By our own witness, by our own life, we are testifying against those forces, and our witness in itself is a protection in a way, if I understood your question properly. But Allan, perhaps you can add something to that.
Thank you, Professor Kgatla. Thank you for those questions. The question about Belhar and the location. Belhar is the township right next door, as you know. We, as a synod in 1982 and 86, when Belhar was first formulated and then formally adopted 4 years later, met in our synod hall, which is the church in Belhar, Suid-Afrikaanse Gesticht. And we use that building as the building in which we gather for our synod meetings, where representatives from all over the country used to come to deliberate on these matters. We called it the Confession of Belhar because there is a tradition in the ecumenical movement that important declarations, theological declarations or other declarations, are named after the place where the churches were meeting. So you have that famous declaration, the mission declaration of Tambaran, which met in India in 1928. You have the Cottesloe Declaration, when the World Council of Churches called together its member churches after Sharpeville in 1960 to deliberate with the churches what should the church's response be to what happened at Sharpeville, and that became the Cottesloe Declaration. In Germany, the Confessing Church came together to make its theological declaration against Nazism and against the so-called German form of Christianity in a place called Barmen, and they called it the Barmen Declaration. And so we decided that our confession will be named after the place called Belhar, but it has another significance. You will have heard me say in my response to the lecture that Belhar is a place that represents people who have been removed from wherever they're. This is a place where people are not because they want to live here. This is forced removal that you see here. And so the church that we have here is a church that was formed in 1789. Where's the minister? Dr. McMaster, 1789? It was a church formed for slaves. It still exists in Long Street in Cape Town. But we could not use that as a church, not because the church became too small for the members, because of group areas. We were forced out of the city, and that slave church had to move here. And so it still has the name Suid-Afrikaanse Gesticht, which was the name of the original congregation, but it is no longer there where it was. And so forced removals, the land question brought us here where we are today. And so when you talk about Belhar, what does Belhar, I don't know about the trust, and I hope that the trust will be serious about the question. You have heard me mention that I think that our reconciliation is incomplete if it does not include the restoration of the land, the restoration of our history, and the restoration of our dignity, and the restoration of justice. That's how I read Belhar. When I see Belhar say that we must stand with God's suffering people in any form of injustice, that's what it means. So we must rise up with the people. We must not let up. This is an important issue for us now. And we must not be misled. We must not be bamboozled by sweet words of whoever from the highest office. Land is land, and it must be returned, is my view.
Thank you so much for the responses. Colleagues, I think it's a great point to end this lecture. We would like to thank Prof Kgatla for delivering the lecture that painted broad picture and history of the Belhar Confession. And thank you, Prof Boesak, for raising provocative questions around the legacy of Belhar and the sense in which Belhar might be a living document for our times. Thank you so much for those joining us virtually, and thank you so much for everybody who joined us in person. As we come to the close of this lecture, there are some drinks on our way out. Unfortunately, for those that are seated lower here, we may have to still find our way up. The foods and we have some snacks. They'll be served close to where we just registered. So thank you so much to everyone, and we end here.